New Guinea, 1943. The jungle devours Allied machinery like a living organism. American Stuarts bog down in swamps, British Matildas shed their tracks on rocky trails, and Japanese positions remain impregnable. It is at this precise moment that a strange machine arrives on the front line, making U.S. officers grimace with disgust. Before them stands a tank that looks as if it were welded together in a provincial garage from scraps of plumbing pipes and tractor parts. An American colonel, glancing at the angular silhouette, throws over his shoulder, "The Australians sent us an ashtray on tracks." Laughter echoes through the camp. But 72 hours later, that same colonel will be demanding Canberra send 24 more of these ashtrays because this very machine will break the defensive line where elite American units had lost all hope. This is the story of the AC1 Sentinel, an armored monster born of desperation, forged from automotive spare parts and destroyed by the order of the very generals who once begged to receive it, a machine that proved its superiority over U.S. and British equipment in real combat, yet vanished from the pages of history not due to design flaws, but because of the political games of great powers. Today, of the 65 produced, only a few museum pieces remain, witnesses to how engineering genius was sacrificed for diplomatic interests. December 1941 unleashed a nightmare upon Australia that no one had expected. Pearl Harbor is burning. Singapore, the impregnable fortress of the British Empire, will fall in 69 days, and Japanese aircraft carriers are already slicing through the waters of the Coral Sea. Darwin, the continent's northern gateway, suffers bombings surpassing the attack on Pearl Harbor in intensity. 242 aircraft of the Imperial Navy wiped the port infrastructure off the face of the earth in 90 minutes. Australia physically feels the breath of invasion. Reconnaissance submarines are spotted near Sydney, saboteurs land on the northern coast, and the General Staff in Melbourne receives forecasts from military analysts. At the current rate of advance, Japan could begin landing on the mainland in 4 to 6 months. No one then suspected that this very catastrophe would give birth to a tank that would make Detroit engineers swallow nervously. The reality turns out to be even bleaker than the Japanese threat. Britain, which had promised protection to the Dominions for decades, turns its troops towards Suez. London is saving Egypt and couldn't care less about Sydney. Churchill states directly to Australian Prime Minister John Curtin, quote, 6, translated from diplomatic to human language, "You're on your own. The United States directs its main resources to the European theater. The _7_ doctrine turns the Pacific Front into a secondary concern. Australian divisions fighting in North Africa are urgently recalled home, but the sea voyage takes weeks, while the Japanese advance in days. Churchill's condescension would cost the empire more than the Prime Minister could imagine. In this environment, the General Staff conducts an inventory of armored vehicles and discovers a disaster for the entire continent. 3 light_9_ tanks bought back in the 1930s, a few obsolete armored cars, and training mock-ups made of plywood. There are no tank factories, no tank building experience, no blueprints, no specialized armor, no aviation engines for tanks. There are only railways, a few steel foundries, General Motors Holden car factories, and engineers who, before the war, riveted trucks and tractors. A request to London for tank supplies receives a formal reply. British capacities are booked for 2 years in advance. Wait. An appeal to Washington hits the same wall. American _10_ are going to Europe and Africa. For Australia, there are only light _11 in limited quantities and at an unknown date. 3 months later, these refusals would turn into the worst decision the Allies made during the entire war. January 1942, the Melbourne office of the War Ministry gathers men who have never seen a tank up close but are now obliged to create one. Colonel Watson of the Engineering Corps opens the meeting with a phrase that sounds like a sentence, so as to quote 12. The attendees are silent. Among them are designers from the Holden Car Company, engineers from the Railway Department, representatives from the steel concern BHP, and a handful of officers who had seen British quote 13 in Africa. One engineer timidly raises his hand, quote 14. Watson chuckles, quote 15. 48 hours later, these men begin what London will call technical heresy and Washington, a threat to the post-war order. The group receives the code name, quote, 16, quote, 17, quote, an Australian-made cruiser tank. The task is set rigidly: create a medium tank capable of withstanding Japanese, quote, 18, quote, tanks and breaching field fortifications. Requirements: crew of 4, armor up to 65 millimeters, armament, a 2-pounder gun, road speed of 48 kilometers per hour. But the main condition sounds almost mocking. Use only those materials and technologies available in Australia right now. No imports of critical components. No waiting for deliveries. Everything must come from what is lying in warehouses and workshops. The first problem arises within a week. Australian industry does not produce tank engines. British, quote, 19 and American, quote, 20 are unavailable. A request to Detroit for engines receives the answer, quote, 21. Holden engineers propose an insane idea. Take 3 Cadillac automobile engines and connect them into a single block. It sounds like the raving of a drunk mechanic, but there is no alternative. Who could have known that 3 car engines connected by water pipes and prayers would outlast elite British motors? Each Cadillac puts out 117 horsepower. 3 motors will yield 351 horses, theoretically enough for a 28-ton machine. The problem is that no one in the world has ever created a tank power unit from 3 car engines synchronized through a common crankcase. It is technical nonsense that should fall apart at the first startup. While Detroit stamped out tanks on assembly lines, the Australians welded them in sheds, and this would become their advantage. Armor is the next headache. The British use special homogeneous steel, rolled under monstrous pressure. Australia has no rolling mills of such scale. A metallurgist from BHP finds a solution: cast the hull whole, like a giant cast iron part. Cast armor is theoretically weaker than rolled armor, but if you increase the thickness by 15 to 20%, the strength evens out. British experts, upon reviewing the proposal, send a condescending memorandum. Quote, 23. The Australians nod, thank them for the valuable advice, and continue casting hulls. A year later, this quote, 24 armor will withstand a direct hit from a Japanese anti-tank gun without a single crack. June 1942. A factory workshop in the Melbourne suburb of Maribyrnong resembles an alchemist's laboratory where, instead of the Philosopher's Stone, they are trying to create a war machine. The first AC1 prototype is assembled from components never intended to work together. The running gear is borrowed from the American quote, 25 the only tank for which blueprints were obtained through the military mission. The turret is designed from scratch because the 2-pounder gun requires a specific layout. The hull is cast at the steel plant as a single piece, a method British engineers disavowed in official documents. The transmission is copied from a heavy truck, reinforced, and adapted for tracks. And in the engine compartment towers a triune monster of quote, 26 connected by a homemade transfer case and a common cooling system. June 24th, the day of the first startup. The test site is filled with skeptics, officers of the General Staff, representatives of the British military mission, American observers. One British major, looking at the angular silhouette of the prototype, utters a phrase that will go down in history. Quote, 28. 3 minutes later, he will be chewing his own words along with his cap. The chief engineer of the project calmly gives the command to the driver. 3 quote, 29 roar simultaneously. A strange sound, unlike the rumble of a standard tank engine, more reminiscent of the growl of 3 enraged beasts. The prototype jerks, tracks bite into the soil, and the machine begins to move. 10 meters, 20, 50, 100 meters in a straight line, then a turn, then acceleration to 30 kilometers per hour. The turret rotates smoothly. The suspension absorbs the bumps of the proving ground. The driver reports over the radio. Quote, 30, the British major takes off his cap and silently hands it to the Australian colonel. The triumph lasted exactly until the moment a telegram with the test results was sent to Washington. The real test begins a week later, firing and durability tests. The 2-pounder gun installed in the turret shows unexpected accuracy. At a distance of 800 meters, the shell hits a 1.5 by 1.5 meter square with 87% probability. For comparison, the American .31 with a 37 millimeter gun gives 72% accuracy at the same distance. British observers demand an armor resistance test. They are certain the cast hull will crack like a nut. The prototype is taken to the firing range and fired upon with a captured Japanese 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. The first shell hits the frontal projection at a 60-degree angle, ricochet. The second shell hits directly into the side. The armor holds, no spalling inside the hull. The third shell is aimed at the turret, a gouge on the armor but no penetration. The metallurgist from BHP Triumph, cast armor works no worse than rolled armor and is 3 times easier to produce. The British theorists fall silent, burying their noses in notebooks full of calculations that have just turned into waste paper. What happened next on the proving ground would be classified for 30 years, not by the Japanese, but by the Allies themselves. August 1942. Mass production is launched at 3 factories simultaneously, Maribyrnong, Chullora, and Clovelly. The plan is insanely ambitious, to produce 70 tanks a month by the beginning of 1943. For a country that 6 months ago didn't even have tank blueprints, this sounds like science fiction. But the engineering staff works without weekends. Every part is optimized for mass production. Cast hulls flow from BHP. The technology is refined to automation. The triple engine units are assembled on the Holden conveyor. Automotive capacities were retooled in 6 weeks. Turrets are stamped at railway factories. The equipment there allows for bending thick steel. By the end of August, the first production vehicle, designated AC1 Sentinel, leaves the shop. The British military mission demands comparative trials. AC1 versus the British Crusader Mark IV and the American M3 Stuart. The proving ground near Melbourne turns into an arena for techno-gladiators. Test 1. Speed and maneuverability. The Crusader takes the lead on the asphalt highway. Its Nuffield engine delivers 440 horses, and the 30-ton machine accelerates to 52 kilometers per hour. But as soon as they turn onto dirt, the picture changes so sharply that British officers demand a recount. The Sentinel, with its wide tracks and low ground pressure, overtakes its opponents on boggy sections. The 351 horses of the 3 Cadillacs push 28 tons to 45 kilometers per hour over cross-country terrain, while the Crusader slips, and the Stuart gets stuck in the loam entirely. Test 2 finally buries the reputation of civilized machinery. Reliability in extreme conditions. All 3 tanks are sent on a 48-hour forced march along a route simulating New Guinea conditions. Mud, high humidity, temperature changes, crossing water obstacles. The Stuart breaks down after 31 hours, engine overheating due to mud-clogged radiators. The Crusader lasts 39 hours and stops with a transmission failure. Mud got into the gear-shifting mechanism. The Sentinel completes the full route and is ready to continue. The secret lies in the design. The Australians designed the machine for the tropics from the start. Enlarged air intakes with mud filters, an engine compartment with redundant ventilation, a transmission protected by additional casings. All this made the tank outwardly bulky and ugly by British or US standards, but phenomenally durable in the mud of the Pacific. Ugliness proved to be an advantage. What London aesthetics called provincial crudeness, soldiers at the front called the only machine that won't die on the first day. The most impressive test occurs in September, live firing with a simulation of real combat. The target, a Japanese field fortification recreated from intelligence data from Malaya, a pillbox made of logs and earth 2 meters thick, the embrasure covered by a steel shield. The Stuart opens fire first. The 37 millimeter gun strikes 4 times, 2 hits on the shield, but no penetration. The Crusader with its 2-pounder shoots 3 times. 1 hit chips a piece of the shield, but the fortification remains functional. The Sentinel fires 2 shots. The first punches through the shield. The second shell enters the embrasure and explodes inside the pillbox. The simulation is destroyed. U.S. officers frown. The British demand a recount. Australian artillerymen grin. Their 2-pounder uses ammunition with an increased charge, developed specifically for penetrating fortifications. 2 weeks later, the test results land on President Roosevelt's desk, and the dirtiest campaign in the history of tank building begins. November 1942. Production of the AC1 gathers pace. 65 machines have already rolled off the lines. The plans are ambitious to form 3 full tank battalions of 50 machines each by the summer of the next year. The general staff is euphoric. For the first time in history, Australia has its own armored power, independent of the whims of allies. Requests from frontline commanders multiply. Officers who saw the Sentinel on the proving grounds demand the tanks be sent to New Guinea immediately. American General MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Pacific, personally visits the factory in Maribyrnong and, after an inspection, declares, "If I had 200 of these machines, I would take Rabaul in a month." These words of MacArthur's would be struck from all official documents 3 months later, as if they were never spoken. In Washington and London, they look at the Australian project with growing irritation. The reason is simple and cynical: lend-lease politics. The United States invested colossal resources in creating a military aid program for allies. The scheme is simple. America produces equipment, sends it to allies on loan or lease, and after the war, these countries pay back with influence, trade preferences, and political loyalty. Australia, producing its own tanks, falls out of the scheme. Moreover, if the quote 55 proves more effective than American analogs, an uncomfortable question arises: why should Canberra buy quote 56 and quote 57 from Uncle Sam if their own industry performs better? December 1942. A commission from Washington arrives in Melbourne, formally to assess the capabilities of Australian military industry, in reality to prepare the strike. American specialists spend a week at the factories, studying blueprints, interviewing engineers. The commission's report, sent to the Pentagon, contains 23 pages of technical nitpicking, not one of which is backed by real tests. The AC1 is criticized for everything. The cast hull is, quote, 58. The triple engine unit is, quote, 59. The 2-pounder gun is, quote, 60. The dimensions are, quote, 61. Not a single point is supported by actual trials. It is all based on theoretical assumptions, and experts who have never seen a "in the mud of New Guinea" pass judgment on a machine that passed all tests with triumph. January 1943. Washington delivers a blow from which Australian tank building will never recover. A program of mass equipment supplies for the Pacific theater is announced. Australia is promised 600 quote 64 within a year, a fantastic figure that completely overshadows local production capabilities. There is only one condition: Canberra must shut down the AC project and reorient factory capacities to the repair and maintenance of American equipment. Prime Minister Curtin faces a choice: continue developing domestic industry, but get tanks by year's end, or accept the American offer and arm the military immediately. The pressure is monstrous, and the Japanese still threaten the northern borders. Generals demand tanks here and now. Allies hint that refusing the Shermans will be seen as ingratitude and could affect other supplies: planes, ammunition, fuel. Curtin receives an unofficial letter from the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. The text is diplomatic, but the meaning is harsh. Continuing the AC project will create unnecessary friction in Allied relations at a critical moment of the war. Translation to human language: close your project, or we turn off the resource taps. February 1943. The Australian government makes a decision that will bury national tank building for 70 years. Project AC1 is officially closed. All factory capacities are transferred to automobile production, repair of imported equipment, and spare parts manufacturing. 65 finished Sentinels are sent not to the front, but to warehouses for preservation. The wording of the government decision is vague. Due to the sufficiency of armored vehicle supplies from allies, the production of domestic tanks is deemed inexpedient. The project's engineering staff is disbanded. Designers return to car factories. Blueprints are classified and sent to the War Ministry archives. Internal memoranda, declassified 50 years later, reveal the cynical truth without diplomatic varnish. The Minister of Defense writes to the Prime Minister, quote, 70. In other words, Australia was forced to bury a successful project so as not to offend an ally whose economic and military power made them indispensable. The tank that survived Japanese shells and tests did not survive American memoranda in real politics. The British also had a hand in destroying the quote, _71 London never forgave the Australians for their independence. A Dominion was supposed to obediently wait for British equipment, not invent its own. One British general in private correspondence openly states, quote, 72. This 18th century paternalism sounded anachronistic in the middle of the 20th century, but Britain still considered itself entitled to dictate terms. Imperial arrogance cost soldiers lives, but who in London cared about that, where world maps were painted in the pink color of colonial possessions? March 1943, New Guinea, Kokoda area. Australian infantry is pinned down by Japanese fire against the swampy bank of a river. American Stuarts, which were supposed to support the advance, are stuck in mud on the approach to the front line. Light tanks are not designed for the mire of tropical jungles. British Matildas sent from Africa are slow and clumsy. Their 17-ton mass and narrow tracks turn every movement into torture. The offensive stalls. Casualties rise. The battalion commander sends a desperate request to headquarters. Where are the Australian tanks that underwent trials in Melbourne? We were told they handle mud best of all. The answer arrives 2 days later and sounds like a spit in the face to dying soldiers. AC1 tanks are preserved in storage according to government decision, await arrival of American Shermans within 4 to 6 weeks. 4 weeks for a soldier dug in under Japanese fire is an eternity. Officers at the front are furious. One captain writes in his diary, "They gave us a working weapon, tested it, proved its superiority, and then hid it in a warehouse so as not to offend the Yanks. Boys are dying in the mud because someone in Canberra decided politics is more important than lives." These lines were never officially published. Censorship excised any criticism of Allied relations. April 1943 opens with an event that proves the dead engineers right. One of the preserved Sentinels manages to get to the front, not by official order, but thanks to the initiative of local command. An Australian tank unit colonel deployed to New Guinea learns of a warehouse with AC-1s nearby Port Moresby. He personally arrives at the warehouse, flashes an order for a vehicle condition check, and convinces the base commander to release one tank for field trials. The machine is demothballed, refueled, systems checked, and 3 days later sent to the front line. April 23, 1943, operation to capture Japanese positions at the Camusi River. Australian infantry must cross the river and secure the opposite bank, but the Japanese have turned every tree into a firing point. American Stuarts try to approach the crossing but bog down 200 meters from the shore. The ground is too soft. Artillery fires blindly. The jungle swallows the shells. Effectiveness is zero. The attack falters. Casualties, 47 men in 2 hours. The battalion commander is ready to order a retreat when the radio man reports, "Sir, some tank is approaching us, not ours, not American." A minute later, an AC-1 crawls out of the jungle, the very ashtray on tracks that was ridiculed in Melbourne. The crew, 4 Australians, driver, gunner, loader, and commander. They receive the task to break through to the river and suppress Japanese firing points at any cost. The tank moves slowly, tracks biting into the swampy soil with a characteristic squelch. Stuarts are stuck in this section, but the Sentinel goes on. Wide tracks and low ground pressure do their job. The Japanese open fire. A 37mm anti-tank gun strikes the frontal armor. The shell ricochets with a scream, leaving only a silvery scratch on the cast steel. A second shot hits the turret, a gouge on the armor, but no penetration. The tank continues moving. The 2-pounder gun swings toward the Japanese position. One shot, the pillbox explodes from within. A second shot, a machine gun nest falls silent. Third, fourth, fifth. Methodically, without haste, the crew destroys fortifications one by one. Within 40 minutes of combat, the Japanese defense at the crossing sector is completely suppressed. Australian infantry crosses the river under the tank's cover. Casualties during the crossing, 3 wounded, no deaths. The AC1 returns to the starting position with 17 gouges on its armor, none of which penetrated the hull. The driver reports, quote, 88. An American officer who watched the battle walks up to the tank commander and says, quote, 89. The victory lasted exactly 7 days, then began the oblivion that would last 70 years. A week later, the tank is recalled from the front by direct order from MacArthur's headquarters. The wording, quote, 90. The real reason, someone in U.S. command learned that the Australian tank performed better than American ones at the front, creating uncomfortable questions. The machine is returned to the warehouse. The crew transferred to, quote, 91, and the combat report classified, quote, 92 for 30 years. The story of the Camusi River would surface only in 1973 in the memoirs of a participant. A veteran published a diary detailing that battle. By that time, most witnesses had passed away, and the fact of the AC-1's combat use was never officially recognized by U.S. military historians. An inconvenient truth for a country that positioned itself as the arsenal of democracy, May 1943 to December 1945. 65 Sentinels spend the war in warehouses like prisoners sentenced to oblivion for the crime of superiority. Some machines are used for crew training. Mechanics learn to service the transmission, gunners train on turret mounts, drivers take courses in tracked vehicle operation, but not a single tank sees the front again. All combat operations are conducted in American and British machines. By the war's end, there are over 2,000 imported tanks in Australia, quote, 95, and, quote, 96, Portus, quote, 97, quote, 98. Domestic production is dead and buried. 1946, the war is over, the army demobilizes, and the victors divide the world. The question arises, what to do with the preserved AC-1s? The War Ministry considers options: sell as scrap metal, give to museums, keep for future conflicts. A cynical and symbolic decision is made. Most tanks are sent to be melted down. The cast armor goes into the production of agricultural machinery and construction beams. The triple engine units are dismantled and sold to private companies. Cadillac engines will still serve in trucks and generators. Turrets and running gear are cut by oxy-fuel torches under the screech of metal that sounds like a dying scream. Of 65 machines, 6 specimens remain. 1 for the War Memorial in Canberra, 2 for memorials in Melbourne and Sydney. 3 go to private collections. The armor that held Japanese shells in New Guinea now turns into barn beams and tractor parts. 1947 brings the cruelest blow. All blueprints and technical documentation of the AC project are destroyed. The formal reason, quote, 100. The real reason, pressure from the U.S. and Britain. Both allies insist that Australia definitively abandon attempts to create its own tank industry. Washington offers lucrative contracts for the supply of post-war, quote, 101, and modernized, quote, 102. London hints at the possibility of licensed production of British, quote, 103. In both cases, the condition is the same: no domestic developments, no technological independence. Australia agrees. Blueprints are burned in the furnaces of the War Ministry. Engineering solutions that were ahead of their time turn to ash. The engineers who created the, quote, 104 leave for civil engineering and the auto industry. The technologies of cast armor are forgotten. The secrets of the triple engine unit are lost. 20 years later, no one will be able to recreate the tank from memory. The knowledge dissolves along with the generation of its creators. 1960s. The Cold War is in full swing. Australia participates in conflicts in Southeast Asia, Korea, Malaya, Vietnam. The Army uses American M48 and British M106. Both machines are heavy, gas-guzzling, and require complex maintenance. In Vietnam, the tanks perform ambiguously. Jungles and swamps ruin equipment just as they did 20 years ago in New Guinea. Old veterans who fought in '43 recall with bitterness. We had a tank created specifically for these conditions. We buried it because the Yanks got offended. History repeats itself with mocking precision. Again, jungles, again, mud, again, imported tanks bogging down where a sentinel could have passed. 1974, Australian military history researcher Peter Charlton publishes an article, "The Forgotten Sentinel, the Tank That Wasn't." He is the first to raise the question, why was a successful project closed at the height of the war? Charlton gains access to declassified War Ministry documents and discovers correspondence between Canberra, Washington, and London. The picture that emerges is shocking. The tank was destroyed not because of technical flaws, but because of political pressure from allies. The publication causes a scandal. Veteran organizations demand an official investigation. The government answers evasively. Decisions were made under wartime conditions based on strategic necessity. The topic is hushed up for another 20 years. The truth is uncomfortable for everyone. For Canberra, who betrayed its own engineers, for Washington, who strangled a competitor, for London, who feared losing control over a colony. 1990s. With the end of the Cold War, new layers of documents are declassified, and every new archive file adds dirt to the history of Allied brotherhood. Historians gain access to American archives and discover Pentagon memoranda dedicated to the problem of Australian tank building. One document is particularly eloquent. A U.S. military intelligence report from January 1943 directly recommends exerting pressure on the Australian government to terminate the AC project, as independent Dominion tank building creates a risk of reduced demand for American equipment after the war. No technical assessment, no tests, pure economics and geopolitics. The tank was buried not because it was bad, but because it threatened the post-war profits of American corporations and Pentagon contracts. Soldiers died in the mud so that shareholders of Chrysler and General Motors could receive dividends. 2010s. In Australia, interest in the history of the Sentinel is revived, not out of nostalgia, but from a belated realization of the scale of the betrayal. The War Memorial in Canberra conducts a massive restoration of the only fully combat-capable AC1 specimen. The tank is brought to working condition. The three Cadillacs roar just as they did 70 years ago. The public sees the machine in motion for the first time in decades. The reaction is unexpected, not only veteran nostalgia, but admiration from engineers. Modern specialists, having studied the design, admit, for its time, the Sentinel was a technological breakthrough. The cast hull, which the British considered unreliable, in practice turned out to be stronger than many examples of rolled armor. The triple-engine unit, ridiculed as amateurish, worked more reliably than single-engine analogs. If one engine failed, the other two allowed the tank to get to base. The engineering solutions applied in the AC1 were decades ahead of their time. Wide tracks, a standard for modern main battle tanks. Low ground pressure, a key characteristic for machines operating in the weak soils. Modular power unit construction, a principle used today in Merkava and Leopard 2 tanks. The Australians invented this in 1942, having neither a theoretical base nor examples to imitate. Pure engineering intuition multiplied by desperation gave birth to technologies that world tank builders would only reach 40 years later. The bitterest realization comes when historians compare the fates of tank programs in different countries. Canada created the Ram, a medium tank based on the American M3. The machine was unsuccessful, not used in combat, but the program was not closed until the end of the war because Ottawa had political weight in relations with Washington. South Africa began developing its own Marmon Harrington light tank, a primitive machine with bulletproof armor, but the project was supported by London because the Dominion controlled vital sea routes. Australia created a technically superior tank, proved its effectiveness in battle, but lacked the political capital to protect its invention. Geographic isolation, small population, dependence on allies for fuel and ammunition supplies, all this turned Canberra into a junior partner whose opinion could be ignored with impunity. Engineering superiority shattered against the wall of geopolitics, as always in human history. 2024, 6 surviving examples of the AC1 Sentinel exist in Australia. 1 at the War Memorial in Canberra, fully combat capable, participating in demonstrations. 2 in memorial complexes in Melbourne and Sydney, static exhibits preserved for long-term storage. 3 in private collections, conditions vary from good to fair. Of the 65 machines produced in 1942 to 43, less than 10% remain. The rest went to the smelter, became bridges, trusses, farm equipment. The cast armor that held Japanese shells in New Guinea now holds up barn roofs in the Queensland outback. The memory of the Sentinel lives not only in museums, but in the minds of engineers rediscovering forgotten solutions. In the 2000s, Australian engineers developing armor upgrades for the Army studied archive materials of the AC project. Some solutions, such as the complex-shaped cast hole or modular power unit, are being considered for application in modern IFVs and light tanks. 80-year-old technologies are becoming relevant again. One of the lead engineers of the Boxer IFV modernization program says in an interview, when we started working on the project, we were told to study World War II experience. We thought there would be a pile of obsolete nonsense. And then we stumbled upon the Sentinel blueprints. I nearly fell off my chair. These guys solve problems we are fighting with now, and they solve them more elegantly than we do. The story of the AC1 Sentinel is a story of how engineering talent and national determination shatter against the wall of big politics without any chance of victory. Australians created a tank that surpassed US and British analogs in the conditions of the Pacific Theater. The machine passed tests, proved effectiveness in battle, won the recognition of frontline commanders, but it was destroyed not by the enemy, but by allies, not by fire and steel, but by memoranda and political pressure. 65 tanks were buried in warehouses because their existence hurt the ambitions of great powers. Hundreds of Australian soldiers died in the mud of New Guinea waiting for Shermans that got stuck in the same mud where Sentinels walked as if on asphalt. The final paradox of this story, in the Museum of the Aberdeen Proving Ground in the USA, where the world's largest collection of tanks is gathered, there is a plaque reading, quote, 131. Below the plaque is an empty space. The tank is missing. The exhibit was not transferred because all machines were destroyed or scattered, but the plaque hangs, a symbol of technology that existed, worked, triumphed, but disappeared because it turned out to be politically inconvenient. In this void lies the entire history of Australia's garage gladiators, an engineering triumph strangled by diplomacy. Metal melted down, blueprints burned, memory erased. Only 6 museum exhibits remain, along with the bitter realization the best tanks don't always win wars if politics decides otherwise.